In 2005, in a suburban American garage, a custom car audio installer did not reach for a screwdriver to mount a new subwoofer. He signaled for a forklift. Hovering above to the custom-welded chassis of an SUV was the MTX JackHammer, a 22-inch, 369-pound cone of terror that cost over $10,000. It could not run on a standard electrical system. It required multiple high-output alternators just to wake up. For decades, an American stereo system was designed to faithfully reproduce the sound of a recording. The JackHammer was designed to physically destroy the air pressure inside a vehicle. It shattered windshields, cracked sheet metal, and deafened anyone sitting in the front seat. The paradox was absolute. Young Americans were paying the price of a used car to obliterate their own vehicles with bass. But the real story of the MTX JackHammer is not just the story of a ridiculous acoustic weapon. It is the story of the absolute peak of the American car audio empire, and what happened when the extroverted way America wanted to be heard suddenly went quiet. Every week, we tell the stories of the American speakers, audio brands, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music, movies, and memory. And what happened when the market moved on? Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place. In the sun-baked parking lots of the American Midwest in the early 2000s, MTX Audio was not born in a sterile Silicon Valley laboratory, nor was it founded by coastal acoustic elites trying to capture the delicate breath of a jazz vocalist. It was born in the rural American Midwest, in a world of pickup trucks, gravel roads, and working-class expectations. In 1979, an engineer named Lloyd Ivy took over a small audio company in Winslow, Illinois, eventually bringing it under the umbrella of his corporation, MTX. The company's early mandate was simple: build reliable, rugged audio equipment that could survive the physical reality of the American road. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, MTX had established a reputation for building tough, carpet-covered speaker enclosures designed specifically to fit behind the seats of Chevrolet and Ford pickup trucks. At the time, the American car audio market was a very different arena. For decades, the factory radio in a dashboard was merely a tool to catch the morning news or listen to a fading FM rock station. The trunk of a car was a place for spare tires, jumper cables, and groceries. But as the 1990s progressed, the cultural center of American music shifted. Hip-hop, Miami bass, and electronic dance music demanded something that a factory-installed 5-inch paper speaker could never deliver. American teenagers and young adults realized that the cabin of a car was essentially a rolling acoustic chamber. They began visiting local stereo stores and demanding more low-end authority. But there was a problem. The American market lacked speakers designed specifically for extreme automotive abuse. Early car audio enthusiasts often tried to repurpose home hi-fi equipment, shoving living room speakers into the backs of hatchbacks. The results were disastrous. A living room is a stable environment with controlled temperatures. A car trunk parked in the Texas summer sun can reach 140 degrees. The standard components of the era simply disintegrated. The foam surround, the flexible ring around a woofer cone that lets it move in and out, would dry rot and crack in the heat. The paper cones would absorb winter moisture and warp. And the voice coil, a coil of wire attached to the speaker cone that moves when electricity passes through it, would frequently overheat and snap when connected to cheap aftermarket amplifiers. American listeners needed a speaker that treated the vehicle not as a concert hall, but as a pressure vessel. Throughout the 1990s, the car audio industry exploded into a multi-million-dollar retail ecosystem. Independent stereo shops opened in nearly every suburban strip mall. Crutchfield catalogs arrived in millions of mailboxes, offering a dizzying array of aftermarket audio gear. By 1998, a teenager could open a catalog and buy a highly durable 12-inch MTX subwoofer for roughly $150. For a while, this was enough. A pair of 12-inch woofers, Large drivers designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass and drums mounted in a custom wooden box could make a rearview mirror shake. It was a localized thrill. It was loud enough to annoy parents and impress friends. But by the early 2000s, a new, extreme subculture emerged in American parking lots: SPL competition. SPL stood for Sound Pressure Level. It was a sanctioned automotive blood sport. In organizations like DB Drag Racing, the goal was no longer fidelity. The stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from places between and around two speakers, was completely irrelevant. Competitors did not care about the accurate reproduction of a violin or a guitar. They cared entirely about brute acoustic force. They wanted to see how many decibels of sheer air pressure they could generate inside the sealed cabin of a vehicle. A standard rock concert hits around 120 decibels. In the early 2000s, serious American SPL competitors were pouring concrete into their car doors, bolting sheets of steel to their roofs, and installing bulletproof glass just to contain sound pressure levels exceeding 150 decibels. At this extreme edge of the market, the traditional rules of speaker engineering broke down. In a typical local stereo store parking lot on a Saturday afternoon in 2002, the limits of standard physics were on full display. A competitor would pull a modified Honda Civic up to the testing meter. They would wire multiple high-voltage amplifiers to a pair of premium 15-inch woofers. They would enclose these massive speakers in a custom cabinet, the wooden, plastic, or composite box that holds the drivers and shapes how the speaker interacts with the air. Often, they would use a port, an opening in a speaker cabinet that uses moving air to reinforce bass output, tuned to a highly specific frequency to maximize the violent movement of air. Then, they would turn the volume dial to the maximum. The amplifiers would dump thousands of watts of raw, unclipped electrical current into the speakers. The woofers would thrash violently, pushing outward and pulling inward at terrifying speeds. And then, the inevitable would happen. The voice coil would heat up like the element inside a toaster oven. The epoxy resin holding the copper wire together would boil. Within seconds, a thick plume of acrid gray smoke would pour out of the ported cabinet, filling the parking lot with the unmistakable smell of burning glue and melted copper. The music would stop. The woofer was dead. This was the ceiling of the American car audio market. Teenagers were literally melting their equipment because the speakers could not handle the sheer wattage required to win. Back at MTX headquarters, the engineers watched this escalating arms race. They saw the charred remains of 15-inch woofers returning to their warranty departments. They realized that their brand, which had built its reputation on rugged reliability, was competing in a market that had lost all sense of acoustic sanity. The standard subwoofer was no longer enough. The market was begging for an indestructible object, a woofer that could absorb thousands of continuous watts without breaking a sweat. A woofer so massive it defied the basic spatial logic of a passenger vehicle. The American trunk had become an acoustic battleground, and MTX decided to build the ultimate weapon to win it. When MTX unveiled the T9922 JackHammer in 2005, it was not merely a new car audio product. It was a structural threat to the American automobile. Standing 23 inches tall and weighing 369 pounds, the JackHammer defied every established rule of automotive aftermarket engineering. To understand the sheer absurdity of its construction, one must look at standard audio terminology, completely scaled out of proportion. A subwoofer, a speaker designed to reproduce very low bass frequencies, relies on a magnetic motor to move air. The JackHammer's magnet structure, the heavy assembly of magnetic material that helps drive the voice coil and cone, weighed an astonishing 900 ounces. By comparison, a premium competition-grade subwoofer of the era typically utilized a magnet weighing between 100 and 150 ounces. To manage the extreme heat generated by thousands of watts of electricity, MTX engineers utilized a massive 6.5-inch voice coil, a coil of wire attached to the speaker cone that moves when electricity passes through it. This coil was wound with flat aluminum wire, designed to survive internal temperatures reaching 428 degrees Fahrenheit. The cone itself was a rigid sandwich of fiberglass and carbon fiber, anchored by an oversized foam surround, the flexible ring around a woofer cone that lets it move in and out. This surround was stitched directly to the cone and was nearly 3 inches thick, allowing for a terrifying 2.5 inches of physical excursion. In a standard American living room, a speaker moving a fraction of an inch can produce deep, satisfying bass. Inside a car, a cone moving 2.5 inches acts like an air compressor, violently altering the atmospheric pressure in the cabin. But the engineering was only half of the shock. The true shock was the economic reality of the system. In 2005, the retail price for a single MTX JackHammer was firmly set at $10,000, occasionally rising to $12,000, depending on the specific voice coil configuration. To ground that number in the reality of the American market, the median personal income for an American worker at the time was roughly $35,000 a year. A young driver could purchase a reliable used Honda Civic or Ford Ranger for $4,000. An enthusiast could walk into a stereo store and buy an entire high-end car audio system featuring two 12-inch subwoofers, a custom wooden cabinet, and 2 dedicated amplifiers for $1,500. The JackHammer cost nearly 7 times that amount, and the $10,000 price tag was only the entry fee. The speaker required between 6,000 and 12,000 watts of continuous electrical power to function. An average American car alternator generates roughly 1,500 watts of total electrical energy to run the headlights, the air conditioning, the dashboard, and the engine management system. To install a JackHammer, an owner had to completely abandon their vehicle's factory electrical grid. Installers had to fabricate custom steel brackets in the engine bay to mount 3 or 4 high-output aftermarket alternators. They had to line the trunk with a bank of heavy-duty marine batteries. They had to run pure copper wiring, as thick as a garden hose, from the engine block to the cargo area. Furthermore, the JackHammer could not be placed in a standard wooden cabinet, the box that holds the drivers and shapes how the speaker interacts with the air. The internal pressure generated by the 22-inch cone would literally blow the seams off standard medium-density fiberboard. The enclosure had to be reinforced with steel bracing, bolted directly to the metal chassis of the vehicle. The obvious question, then, was why? Why would an American audio company pour millions of dollars of research and development into a product that almost no one could successfully install, let alone afford? The answer lay in a deep understanding of American retail psychology. The JackHammer was a textbook execution of the halo effect. MTX executives knew that the JackHammer was a physical impossibility for a daily commute, but they also knew it was an unmatched acoustic billboard. In the highly competitive world of aftermarket car audio, brands fought viciously for shelf space and mindshare. When an independent car audio shop, a regional stereo store chain, or a Best Buy installation bay put a dummy JackHammer on display, it stopped foot traffic immediately. It was a brilliant dissonance. A teenager in a suburban strip mall would walk into a shop, stare in total awe at a 369-pound speaker they could never afford, and then walk to the register to buy a pair of $300 MTX Thunder Series subwoofers instead. The sheer existence of the JackHammer legitimized every cheaper product in the MTX catalog. The brand's moat was no longer just rugged reliability. It was pure, unadulterated audacity. The strategy worked perfectly. The JackHammer was immediately embraced by the highest tiers of the American car audio exhibition circuit. It became the undisputed star attraction at the SEMA, Specialty Equipment Market Association show in Las Vegas, Nevada. extreme custom installation shops across California, Texas, and Florida begged regional distributors for floor models. At the Spring Break Nationals in Daytona Beach, one of the largest car audio events in the country, SPL competitors and bass enthusiasts gathered around demonstration vehicles just to witness a forklift lower the massive cone into a reinforced trunk. The badge on the grille was not decoration. It was a promise that this company understood the extreme, loud, public desires of the American street better than anyone else. The JackHammer was a physical impossibility for the average driver, which is exactly why the average driver could not look away. By 2006, the American car audio market had reached a staggering cultural and economic peak. It was no longer a niche hobby confined to the rural Midwest or Southern SPL competitions. It had become a dominant force in mainstream American retail. To understand the true scale of this empire, one had to look at the physical landscape of American commerce. In Los Angeles, custom fabrication shops lined the boulevards. In Miami, extreme audio installations became a mandatory part of car culture. In Chicago, independent stereo stores served as weekend gathering points for teenagers. And in thousands of suburban strip malls across the country, massive big-box retailers like Best Buy and Circuit City dedicated entire aisles, demonstration rooms, and specialized installation bays to aftermarket car audio. The MTX JackHammer stood at the absolute top of this pyramid, casting a long, profitable shadow over the entire industry. The strategy had worked exactly as intended. While only a handful of extreme enthusiasts and professional demo vehicles actually installed the 369-pound behemoth, the sheer myth of the JackHammer drove millions of dollars in sales for MTX's standard equipment. Teenagers in Fort Worth, Texas, or Columbus, Ohio, would walk into a Circuit City, stare at a promotional poster of the JackHammer, and immediately buy a pair of MTX Thunder 4500 subwoofers. They would buy the matching MTX amplifiers. They would buy the custom wiring kits. The halo effect was not just a marketing theory, it was a physical reality playing out on the retail floor every single day. At this moment in American history, listening to music in a car had fundamentally transformed. For previous generations, the goal of a high-fidelity system was accuracy. A listener in a living room wanted a perfect stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from places between and around two speakers, so they could close their eyes and imagine a jazz trio standing in front of them. The young American driver in the mid-2000s wanted something entirely different. They wanted extroverted audio. They did not want to capture the delicate breath of a vocalist. They wanted to weaponize the bass. In a suburban American parking lot, a subwoofer was no longer just reproducing a bass guitar. It was declaring to a 3-block radius that the driver existed. This was the cultural stakes of the era. The heavy bass traveling through the sheet metal of a Honda Civic, a Chevrolet Tahoe, or a Chrysler 300 was a public broadcast of identity. It was a time when the most respected person at a red light was the one whose trunk could rattle the rear-view mirror of the car in the next lane. To achieve this, drivers were willing to endure absurd inconveniences. They gave up their entire cargo space to house massive ported cabinets, the wooden, plastic, or composite boxes that hold the drivers and shape how the speaker interacts with the air. They spent their weekends applying heavy sheets of sound-deadening material to the inside of their doors to prevent the metal from rattling itself to pieces. They installed upgraded alternators and secondary batteries, willingly compromising their vehicle's factory warranty, all in the pursuit of lower frequencies and higher decibels. Every parking lot, every stereo shop, every red light. The country was vibrating. X had successfully tapped into the deepest psychological desire of the young American driver, the need to be felt before they were seen. And having conquered the streets, the retail shelves, and the SPL competition circuits, the JackHammer was about to conquer the most powerful cultural institution of the decade. By 2006, the the JackHammer found its perfect cultural amplifier. MTV's Pimp My Ride. In the highly publicized garages of West Coast Customs and later Galpin Autosports in Southern California, the American vehicle was treated not as mere transportation, but as an entertainment canvas. When resident audio expert Mad Mike required the ultimate statement piece for a build, the MTX JackHammer was the only logical choice. Millions of American viewers watched as a forklift carefully navigated the shop floor to drop the 369-pound speaker into the reinforced cargo area of a heavily modified vehicle. It was reality television, but it reflected a genuine American retail reality. The visual impact of the JackHammer on national television did not just sell a specific speaker, it sold the entire ideology of extreme car audio to a generation of young drivers. On camera, the JackHammer did exactly what it was engineered to do. It destroyed the structural integrity of the vehicle it was placed in. The roof flexed violently. The windshield wipers danced off the glass. The rear-view mirrors snapped off their mounts. To the American teenager watching from a living room couch, this was not a malfunction or a nuisance. It was the ultimate mark of acoustic success. In fact, the arms race of the era became so intense that MTX eventually felt compelled to outdo its own absurdity. They followed the original 22-inch round JackHammer with an even larger 24-inch square version, the T9924, specifically designed to maximize the cone surface area in a given spatial footprint. It was a clear signal to the market. There was no limit. If a customer had the steel bracing, the multiple alternators, and the budget, MTX would build a magnet structure large enough to shatter their windows. At this cultural zenith, the MTX ecosystem was operating as a massive industrial machine. The JackHammer itself sold only in limited numbers, mostly to professional installation shops, wealthy extreme SPL competitors, and corporate demonstration builders, but its existence fueled an empire. Because the JackHammer proved that MTX owned the extreme edge of the market, the company was able to push hundreds of thousands of conventional Thunder Series subwoofers and amplifiers through massive American dealer networks each year. The distribution footprint was staggering. Regional car audio chains like Audio Express and Car Toys dedicated massive square footage exclusively to custom enclosures and aftermarket bass. Independent car audio shops from Los Angeles, California to Baltimore, Maryland proudly displayed MTX banners in their windows. This ecosystem also supported thousands of skilled American workers. Buying a high-end MTX system was only the beginning. The buyer then handed their keys to a custom installer who functioned simultaneously as a carpenter, an electrician, and an acoustic engineer. These installers spent countless hours running zero-gauge copper wire beneath the carpets, fabricating heavy medium-density fiberboard enclosures, wrapping custom door panels in vinyl, and tuning complex crossover networks, the electrical systems that separate bass from treble. The aftermarket car audio industry was a massive engine of domestic labor and retail margin. This was also the golden age of the American Automotive Aftermarket Exhibition. At the annual SEMA show, the Specialty Equipment Market Association gathering in Las Vegas, Nevada, the MTX booth became a mandatory pilgrimage site. Attendees crowded around demonstration vehicles built specifically around the JackHammer. These were not simple wooden boxes. Installers worked with inch-thick acrylic, custom-molded fiberglass, and welded steel tubing just to contain the sheer physical violence of the moving cone. The culture of American music itself had adapted to this hardware. Hip-hop producers and recording engineers in Atlanta, Miami, and Los Angeles were no longer just mixing tracks for living room hi-fi systems or radio broadcasts. They were specifically mastering their low-end frequencies to trigger the physical response of aftermarket car subwoofers. The heavy, sustained bass lines of the mid-2000s were designed to be felt through the foam seat cushions of a Chevrolet Tahoe or a Chrysler 300. The music and the hardware were locked in a symbiotic loop. Picture the American listening scene at this exact peak. It is a Friday night in a crowded retail parking lot. A driver opens the rear hatch of a custom SUV to reveal a glowing wall of multiple amplifiers, thick copper power wiring, and a massive ported speaker cabinet taking up the entire cargo space. The air inside the vehicle is so highly pressurized that the doors physically bulge outward with every bass note. The sound is a physical punch to the chest, loud enough to set off the baggage. Have the car alarms of every vehicle parked within 100 yards. The driver is not trying to hear the delicate details of a recording. The driver is trying to turn the vehicle into an undeniable physical event. It felt like an empire that could scale infinitely. The aftermarket car audio industry assumed that as long as America drove cars, young Americans would want to tear out into factory stereos and fill their trunks with massive wooden boxes, heavy magnets, and oversized drivers. The market had reached a point where the sheer size of the speaker was the only metric that mattered. The bass could be heard 3 blocks away, but a different kind of quiet was already moving through the American auto industry. The decline of the MTX JackHammer and the extreme American car audio empire it represented was not caused by a failure in speaker engineering. The massive subwoofers did exactly what they were designed to do. The voice coils held, the cones pushed air, the magnets maintained their grip. The collapse was triggered by Force 5, a massive, overlapping technological, retail, and listening culture shift. The JackHammer did not break. The American automotive and retail systems that supported it simply dismantled themselves. The first small crack in the foundation did not happen in the trunk. It happened in the dashboard. For decades, the American car audio market relied on a highly standardized piece of automotive real estate, known as the DIN slot. This was the rectangular opening in the center console of nearly every Chevrolet, Ford, and Honda on the road. If a driver wanted better sound, the process was universal. Pull out the cheap factory radio, slide in an aftermarket receiver from a brand like Alpine or Pioneer, and run RCA cables, low-voltage wires that carry clean, unamplified audio signals directly to the trunk. It was a standardized modular system. It made building a massive stereo system as easy as plugging components into a wall. But in the mid to late 2000s, automakers fundamentally changed how they built the American interior. As vehicles became more computerized, companies began integrating the radio directly into the climate control systems, the early navigation screens, and the vehicle's central computer network. The radio was no longer a standalone, replaceable box. It was a molded, computerized piece of the dashboard. This seemingly minor design choice devastated the aftermarket audio industry. If a young driver in 2008 wanted to add a pair of MTX subwoofers to a newly purchased sedan, they could no longer just swap the head unit, the main control panel or radio of a car stereo system. The installation suddenly required dismantling the dashboard, cutting into delicate factory wiring harnesses, bypassing computer sensors, and installing complex line-out converters, devices that tap into amplified factory speaker wires and reduce the signal so an aftermarket amplifier can read it. The process became expensive, complicated, and highly risky. A teenager could no longer spend a Saturday afternoon in a driveway wiring a system with basic hand tools. A mistake could short out a vehicle's entire central computer network, instantly voiding the factory warranty. The barrier to entry for extreme car audio had quietly shifted from budget to heavy engineering complexity. Custom installers, who once functioned as carpenters and acoustic engineers, were now forced to act as automotive software hackers just to get a clean audio signal to the trunk. Simultaneously, the physical space required for extreme bass was disappearing from American life. In 2008, the American economy crashed. and gas prices spiked dramatically. The era of the massive, cheap, gas-guzzling American SUV, the exact vehicles that had served as the rolling acoustic chambers for the SPL generation, came to an abrupt halt. Consumers shifted heavily toward compact cars, hybrids, and smaller, fuel-efficient crossovers. This created a severe physical problem. A subwoofer requires a highly specific internal cabinet volume to operate correctly. A 22-inch jackhammer, or even a pair of standard 12-inch woofers, required massive wooden enclosures that simply could not fit into the cargo area of a modern hatchback without rendering the vehicle useless for daily life. Furthermore, extreme car audio was incredibly heavy. An MTX JackHammer weighed 369 pounds. The custom medium-density fiberboard enclosure often weighed another 150 pounds. The multiple high-output alternators and marine batteries added another 100 pounds. In an era where automakers were shaving ounces off vehicle frames to meet strict fuel efficiency standards, adding 600 pounds of audio equipment to a trunk became an extreme economic liability. The physics of bass reproduction could not shrink. A speaker, a device that turns an electrical audio signal into sound moving through air, needs space to move that air. When the space vanished, the oversized woofers had nowhere to go. This combination of integrated dashboards and shrinking vehicles triggered the first great retail retreat. Independent car audio shops, the lifeblood of the custom bass culture, began to notice a severe drop in installation traffic. The bays that used to be full of cars waiting for custom fiberglass enclosures were suddenly sitting empty. Then, the collapse reached the major retail chains. Circuit City, once a dominant force in bringing aftermarket car audio to the American suburbs, filed for bankruptcy in 2008 and liquidated its stores. The massive, glowing walls of demonstration stereos went dark. Best Buy began aggressively shrinking its car audio footprint. The square footage previously dedicated to heavy wooden speaker cabinets, crossovers, and amplifiers was quietly replaced by displays for mobile phones and flat-screen televisions. For MTX, the halo effect of the JackHammer began to stall. The strategy of using a $10,000 speaker to sell $300 subwoofers only worked if the customer believed they could actually install those smaller subwoofers in their car. As dashboards locked the consumer out, the fantasy of extreme custom audio began to fade. The JackHammer sitting on the showroom floor slowly transitioned from an aspirational billboard into a museum piece of a bygone era. The hardware was still flawless. The cars had simply rejected it. But an even deeper, more fatal shift was happening, not in the vehicle, but in the mind of the American listener. For more than a decade, the American teenager with disposable income had a single, defining priority: the vehicle. The car was the ultimate social avatar, and the stereo system was its voice. But between 2007 and 2010, the cultural definition of premium audio changed overnight. The shift was driven by two massive disruptions: the introduction of the smartphone and the rise of premium bass-heavy headphones like Beats by Dre. To understand why this killed the extreme car audio market, one must look at the psychology of the American listener. A massive subwoofer in a custom-ported cabinet was a tool of extreme extroversion. It was designed to project a physical presence outward. It demanded an audience, willing or unwilling. Headphones were the exact opposite. They were a tool of extreme introversion. They built an acoustic wall between the listener and the rest of the world. Suddenly, young Americans did not want to share their music with a 3-block radius. They wanted to retreat into a highly curated, private digital environment. The social capital of audio moved from the trunk of the car to the sides of the head. The economic reality of this shift was devastating for companies like MTX. A teenager could walk into a Best Buy, bypass the shrinking car audio installation bay entirely, and spend $300 on a pair of premium headphones. For that price, they received deep, heavily equalized bass that they could carry everywhere, on the school bus, in the bedroom, and walking down the street. Why would that same teenager spend $3,000, tear apart their vehicle's dashboard, void their factory warranty, and sacrifice their entire cargo space for sound that was permanently trapped inside a car? As the audience vanished, the culture around extreme bass turned hostile. During the peak of the JackHammer's fame, a rattling trunk at a red light was a sign of status. By 2012, it was increasingly viewed as a public nuisance. Municipalities across the country, from Chicago, Illinois to Los Angeles, California, enacted strict noise ordinances, specifically targeting aftermarket car audio. Police officers began issuing heavy fines to drivers whose stereos could be heard from 50 feet away. The public spectacle of extreme bass was essentially criminalized. The American parking lot went quiet. The teenagers who used to gather outside independent stereo shops to compare decibel levels migrated to online forums and social media. The car was reduced back to mere transportation. This cultural rejection broke the JackHammer's retail magic. The halo effect reversed. When a product represents a culture that is actively dying, its extreme scale no longer looks impressive. It looks absurd. The 369-pound magnet structure, the multiple high-output alternators, and the $10,000 price tag stopped being an aspiration. It became a heavy, ridiculous anchor from a bygone era. The extreme SPL competitors, the people who built the armored vehicles to contain 150 decibels of sound pressure, did not disappear entirely, but they retreated from the public retail space. They became a highly insulated niche community, operating far away from the mainstream consumer market. MTX could no longer use the extreme edge of the market to sell hundreds of thousands of standard subwoofers to average drivers, because the average driver no longer cared. The collapse of the installation ecosystem followed rapidly. The skilled American workers who had made a living building custom medium-density fiberboard enclosures, wrapping fiberglass, and tuning complex crossover networks found themselves without a market. To survive, the remaining independent 12-volt shops stopped building walls of subwoofers. They pivoted to installing backup cameras, remote starters, and basic Bluetooth receivers, small adapters that allowed old car stereos to receive a wireless audio signal from a smartphone. The massive demonstration boards inside big box retailers were torn down. The heavy wooden boxes disappeared from catalogs. The thick copper zero-gauge wiring gathered dust on the shelves. Brands that had built their entire identity on aggressive, extroverted, living room and car audio dominance had to scramble to survive. Many legacy American audio companies pivoted hard into portable audio, slapping their badges on small plastic Bluetooth speakers. Portable devices that receive sound wirelessly from a phone and run on internal batteries. Some brands survived by shifting into marine audio or off-road vehicle systems. Others were quietly bought out, their names licensed to overseas holding companies to be printed on cheap soundbars. The JackHammer itself remained in the MTX catalog for years, a lingering monument to a time when the company ruled the streets. But the ecosystem that supported it was gone. The market forces were absolute. The dashboard locked the installer out. The trunk shrank. The smartphone absorbed the music. The headphones isolated the listener. The massive woofers stopped moving. The custom shops took down their signs. The fiberglass molds were thrown away. The thick copper wires were cut. The retail bays emptied. The parking lots went quiet. The American trunk was silent. The JackHammer still worked perfectly. There was simply nowhere left to put it. MTX audio did not die. Unlike many American audio empires that were entirely swallowed by overseas holding companies or liquidated in bankruptcy court, the company survived the collapse of the aftermarket car stereo boom. They survived because they adapted to the very forces that destroyed their old ecosystem. When the American trunk shrank and the dashboard locked the custom installer out, MTX pivoted. They focused on marine audio, building weather-resistant speakers for boats. They wouldn't They developed rugged integrated soundbars for off-road utility vehicles and ATVs. They built smaller, highly efficient amplified subwoofers designed to slide under the seats of modern compact cars. They learned to work within the strict, limited spaces of the modern world. But the era of the 369-pound, 22-inch acoustic weapon ruling the American retail landscape was permanently over. Today, the JackHammer survives primarily as a mythological object. It exists in a bizarre, highly insulated American preservation community, on vintage car audio forums, Reddit communities, and Facebook Marketplace. A listing for an original T9922 JackHammer is treated as a major event. It is a piece of hardware so massive that secondary buyers have to arrange freight shipping or drive pickup trucks across state lines just to retrieve it. And on YouTube, a new generation of audio restoration vloggers and extreme bass enthusiasts hunt down surviving JackHammers. They do not buy them to commute to work. They buy them to perform acoustic stunts, wiring them to banks of lithium batteries in empty garages to see if the massive voice coil can still shatter a sheet of glass or float a towel in midair. The speaker has transitioned from a retail product into an internet spectacle. But to dismiss the JackHammer as a mere novelty is to misunderstand why the original still matters. An old MTX JackHammer, with its heavy fiberglass cone and massive magnet structure, passes a crucial test of American engineering history. It proves that sound is ultimately a physical event. Today, a listener wearing a pair of noise-canceling Bluetooth headphones hears deep bass, because a digital signal processor, a microchip that manipulates audio frequencies, tricks the human ear into perceiving a low note. It is an algorithmic illusion. The JackHammer used no illusions. It simply moved an extraordinary volume of physical air. It matters because it represents the final era of American automotive freedom, a time when a driver had total mechanical and acoustic control over their vehicle. Today, a modern car is essentially a closed, rolling computer. The audio system is permanently baked into the digital display. You cannot change it without fighting the software. The JackHammer belonged to an era where, if you wanted to change the environment, you simply cut the wood, stripped the copper, and built a new room yourself. Look at the physical sights of this lost empire today. The massive Circuit City in Columbus, Ohio, where teenagers once stood in awe of the glowing MTX demonstration displays, has been bulldozed and replaced by a fitness center. The Best Buy installation bays that once smelled of sawdust and soldering iron smoke are now often used as storage rooms for online order pickups. The thousands of independent suburban 12-volt stereo shops, the places where the heavy, medium-density fiberboard cabinets were actually built, are mostly gone. The brick buildings remain, but they have been converted into window tinting businesses, vape shops, or fast food franchises. The physical spaces where Americans went to learn how to make their cars sound bigger no longer exist. Yet there is a surprising footnote to this story of collapse. Unlike the flagship models of acoustic research Advent or Altec Lansing, which were completely discontinued and lost to history, MTX never officially killed the JackHammer. Long after MTV's Pimp My Ride went off the air, long after the stereo stores closed, and long after the American public rejected extreme extroverted bass, the JackHammer quietly remained in the MTX catalog. Even in recent years, it has been listed as a special order item. It is a ghost ship of American audio, a product that stubbornly outlived the listening culture that birthed it, waiting for a buyer who still believes in 2005. The story of this massive speaker reveals a profound truth about the American market. We say we value power, presence, and physical engineering, but the market consistently rewards convenience, isolation, and digital integration. The decline of the extreme subwoofer was not just a shift in retail. It was a shift in the American personality. We traded the extroverted public broadcast of the stereo system for the introverted private stream of the smartphone. We decided that hearing the music alone was better than feeling the air move together. But somewhere, sitting in the corner of a quiet American garage, resting on a heavy wooden shipping pallet, an original 22-inch cone waits in the dark. The carbon fiber is coated in gray dust. The massive foam surround is completely intact. The copper voice coil is cold, but it is still wired, still magnetic, and still waiting for the power to move the room one more time. See you in the next one.